I begin this project by first working on the legs since all parts of the bench are connected to them in some form or fashion. Since the legs are 3 inches square, I will need to glue up 3 boards per leg. I'm using 5/4 walnut, which is 1.25 inches thick in the rough that will end up being 1 inch thick after milling. So to begin, I cut 19-inch long pieces at the miter saw. The board I'm using is 7 inches wide, so I can get 2 pieces for every 19-inch blank. This board is 100 inches long, and I was able to get 5 sections total. I had to take the 6th section out of a separate board. When milling lumber, I like to get the boards close to their final size so I'm not wasting time and material. So I cut the pieces to 3¼ inches wide out of the 7-inch wide board. I ended up with a total of 12 pieces, 3 pieces per leg. With the pieces close to their final size, I can begin the milling process. I begin by flattening one face and one edge on the joiner. Then referencing that flat face, I run them through the planer to get them to 1 inch in thickness. Before gluing the leg blanks together, I take them back over to the table saw and cut them to their final width of 3 inches. Anytime I glue boards together, I try to make sure that the better looking grain is exposed and I hide any blemishes like knots. As you can see here, the grain matches and I was able to stick the board with the knots in the middle and you won't see them once this is glued together. When gluing the legs together, I put glue on 2 of the 3 legs. I use an ink roller to spread the glue around. When I'm done with the ink roller, I just stick it in this bucket of water and the next day I can wipe the glue off of the roller and I can reuse it multiple times. Next, I place the boards in the clamps and make sure that they're flush along their edges. I'm not worried about aligning the ends of the boards because the leg blanks are still cut oversized, and after this glues up, I will go ahead and cut those to length with my miter gauge at the table saw, so that's not quite as important. Once I have everything aligned, I start applying clamping pressure. I repeated these same steps for the other 3 legs and then I let them set overnight in the clamps to make sure everything is nice and dried. Now that the glue is dried, I can focus on cutting the legs to their final length of 18¼ inches. I begin by first cleaning up one end of each leg and then using a stop block set to the final length, I cut the legs to 18¼ Before cutting any of the joinery, I like to use my smoothing plane to remove all milling marks. I take a few passes on all 4 faces of each leg. Now the legs are ready for their joinery. I like to make reference marks on top of each leg so that once I get them in the order that I feel looks best, I can always get them back in that order. Using a Sharpie, I make marks for the front right, front left, rear right, and rear left. Next, I make a reference mark pointing to the faces that will get the mortises for the aprons. This really helps keep everything in order since not all faces get the same amount of mortises. The side faces will have mortises for the top and bottom aprons, whereas the front and back will only have one apron that's along the top. Using a combination square, I lay out the 1/2 inch mortise. Each time I make a mark, I rotate the leg and make the same mark to ensure that the mortises will be in the same exact location on all faces. Since I'm using a router bit with a fixed diameter, I only need to make 3 marks: the start, stop, and where the bit starts in reference to the edge of the leg. To cut the mortises, I use my plunge router with an edge guide. I'm using a 1/2 inch spiral bit which does a great job of cutting the mortises. To begin, I plunge down the full depth of 1 3/4 at the start line, and then move the bit to the stop line and again plunge to the full depth. Now remove the waste between the 2 holes by lowering the bit 1/4 inch, route away the waste and keep lowering the bit until all the waste has been removed between the start and the stop lines. Since I'm using an edge guide, I know all 12 mortises will be in the same exact location in reference to the edge of the legs. To soften up the appearance of the legs, I put a roundover on all 4 edges of each leg using a 1/4 inch roundover bit at the router table. With the legs complete, I can now focus on the aprons. I begin by laying out the rough boards to find the better looking faces to use, and then I cut them to length at the miter saw. The final thickness of the apron is 1 inch, so again I'm using 5/4 walnut. I first jointed one face and one edge, and now I'm taking them down to their final thickness. Next, I set the fence to 3 inches and cut all 4 aprons to their final width. Using my miter gauge and the stop block, I cut the short aprons to their final length of 10½ inches. Since the longer aprons are longer than my miter gauge, I flushed up the ends, clamped them together, and then cut them at the same time to ensure that they're same exact length. To cut the tenons, my preferred method is to use the dado stack at the table saw. I set up a stop block to 1 3/4, and with the blade raised to 1/4 inch, I slowly remove the waste to give me the 1/2 inch tenon that's 1 3/4 inch long. Since the router left rounded corners in the mortises, I needed to round over the edges of the tenon so that they'll fit. So to begin, I used a rasp to remove a majority of the waste. When using the rasp, I stayed 1/4 of an inch away from the shoulder so that I didn't damage them. To remove the waste I didn't get with the rasp, I just used my chisel. And with any luck, the tenon should be tight enough to lift the leg without it falling out. In order to mount the top to the base, I'm going to be using some tabletop fasteners. So next I put an 1/8 inch straight bit into the router table and set the fence back 1/2 of an inch from the bit and route a groove for the tabletop fasteners. Before cutting the curve in the aprons, I first cut a 3/8 of an inch mortise that will house the panels. I overcut the mortise by about 1/8 of an inch to allow the panels to move during the seasonal changes in humidity. And now with the mortises cut, I can lay out the curves. This little gadget that I'm using here is a drawing bow from Lee Valley, and it makes drawing curves like this extremely simple. And then I head over to the bandsaw. After making a few relief cuts, I remove the waste. And I clean up the saw marks just using my spindle sander. So back at the router table, I inserted a 1/2 inch spiral bit and set the depth also to 1/2 of an inch and routed a mortise for the bottom shelf. And speaking of the bottom shelf, I again milled up some 5/4 walnut and am now cutting it to width at the table saw. After cutting it to width, I then switch over to using my miter gauge to cutting it to length. Both ends of the shelf will have a tenon, and to cut those, I'm using the dado stack and my table saw. After making a pass, I flipped the board to cut all 4 shoulders of the tenon. The final joinery I needed to cut in the bottom shelf was the mortise that the shelf support will be glued into. It's a 2x2 mortise that's 1/4 of an inch deep. To remove the waste, I use my plunge router with the spiral bit. I stayed about 1/8 of an inch away from the line so that I could clean it up with the chisel. The shelf support is a 3x3 block with a tenon on one end that will fit into the mortise that I just cut. To cut the tenon, it's back to the table saw with a dado stack to again remove the waste. I wanted the side panels to match the sapwood and the live edge top, so I went with the spalted maple. To begin, I cut them to their final width at the table saw of 5 inches, and then using the miter gauge, I cut them to their final length of 12 3/4 of an inch. Before assembling the bench, I first sanded everything with 80, 120, 180, and 220 grit sandpaper using my orbital sander. I also broke all of the sharp edges using the 180 grit sandpaper. For the assembly of the bench, I found it easier to glue up the 2 side assemblies first since they are easier to manage. Then, once the glue dried, I came back and glued the longer aprons and the bottom shelf into place, completing the bench glue up. I wanted to take a second to mention that if you're interested in checking out some of the behind the scenes pictures and videos of these builds, be sure to follow me over on Instagram at SimpleCove. I will leave a link in the description below, and be sure to check it out. Next, I wanted to give the shelf support the same appearance as the legs, so I rounded over the edges using a 1/4 inch roundover bit at the router table. With the bench completely glued up, I can now determine what the length of the shelf support needs to be, and so next up I cut it to length at the table saw. And with a little bit of glue in the mortise, I can clamp the shelf support into place and allow it to dry. So moving on to the live edge, or what I like to call the messiest part of the project, I begin by removing the bark first with my mallet. And so next I've switched over to using my chisel. It's important to make sure not to dig into the sapwood when you're using your chisel. An alternative to using a chisel is using a draw knife, and it probably would have been a little bit easier than a chisel. It definitely would have been faster, but I didn't have a draw knife and the chisel seemed to work okay. After I removed as much as I could with the chisel, I then switched over to using my spoke shave. The spoke shave blade was set to an aggressive cut, so it didn't take too long to remove a majority of what was left on the edge. And finally, I used these flap wheel sanding discs to smooth out the edges and to clean them up. I started with the 60 grit and worked my way up to 120 grit. This part of the removal was extremely dusty, so be sure to wear a dust mask or a respirator. To flatten the live edge board, I'm going to be referencing my workbench since it's nice and flat. So to begin, I placed some shims under the board where there were gaps to prevent it from rocking while I'm flattening the surface. And to hold the shims into place, I'm just going to use some hot glue. Next, I clamped 2 long rails to my workbench that the router sled will reference during the flattening process. So this is the router sled. It has an opening that is the same exact width as my router. The hole in the center is where the bit will protrude to make contact with the slab. I set the router bit depth to the lowest part of the slab, and then I began moving the router back and forth, slowly removing away the waste and flattening the slab. As you can see, this is both time consuming and messy, but I couldn't have been happier with the results. the slab ended up dead flat. After flattening the top, I flipped the slab over and flattened the other side the same exact way. The slab had about 3 knots, so I mixed up some tinted epoxy to stabilize them. After the epoxy dried, I ran the slab through the drum sander to remove the marks left by the router and to remove the excess epoxy. So next I trued up the ends with my track saw. I began by squaring off one end of the slab and then made marks at 76 inches on the other end and then cut it to length. Before applying the finish, I sand the slab with 80 grit through 220 grit, again using my orbital sander. And to remove the dust, I wipe the surface with a tack cloth. For the finish, I'm applying a satin wipe-on poly from Minwax, and I'm applying the finish just using a cotton cloth. This is probably my favorite part of the project. Seeing this walnut and the spalted maple pop from the finish never gets old. It makes all of the hard work worth it. I felt for this type of project in this style that I wanted to go with a satin, something that wasn't too glossy, because this live edge type of project I felt just wanted something with a nice dull flat sheen, something that just appeared soft to the touch. After the first coat dried, I sanded everything with 320 grit sandpaper, and as you can see, as I'm sanding, the surface is getting nice and chalky, so that way you know the surface is dried and you're ready to sand it. And then to remove all the dust, I just used a tack cloth, and then I applied 2 more coats of the wipe-on poly. A couple of days after the last coat, I waxed the surface using 4-0 steel wool. This removed any of the dust nibs that were still on the surface and gave the bench a nice consistent sheen and feel. The final piece of the puzzle was to install the tabletop fasteners. So with the bench upside down and placed where I wanted it, I pre-drilled with an 1/8 inch bit and installed the screws. So I'm extremely happy with the outcome of the bench, and I can't think of anything I would change. I love how the live edge came out, and the spalted maple panels really add to the appearance of the base. If you enjoyed the build video, leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And if you're not already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that thumbs up button.